Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, good. I am really excited to be here. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Chris Moore. I'm a consultant at ThoughtWorks. I spend most of my day having conversations with execs about things like future states that they want to achieve and how to describe them, and then how to describe the actions you take to get there. And I'm also currently a design research student at the Royal College of Art in London, where my study is around design and metaphor in organisational change dialogue. You kind of get the connection, right? So before I kind of get into the main business of this, it is working, a little confession. I didn't go to the Royal College of Art to study metaphor. I went there to study service design. I wanted to find out how service design provides agency for organizational change. So I did what you would imagine you do. You'd set up some experiments. You'd create some design briefs, like about the future of work. What's the future of work for the knowledge worker when the knowledge worker is nomadic, and how does the organization own the knowledge, that kind of thing. And what I started to realize was that working with the design teams, they were all talking in metaphor all the time. And then I took one step back and I went, oh my God, service design is just one big metaphor. The central artifact of service design is a blueprint which talks about being on a stage with actors who are in front of the line of sight, and there's a line of sight behind which you can't see anything, and they're all on a journey. It's all a big metaphor. But the weird thing was, when I started to talk to other designers about this, and say, hey, service design is just a big metaphor, right? They kind of look at me slightly surprised, because they weren't realizing that they were actually working within a metaphorical frame to frame their thinking. So framing how we're thinking, but not thinking how we're framing, became a kind of curiosity for me. And that's how I ended up exploring metaphor. And I started to wonder whether, when you hear people talk about methods and models and metaphors as though they're all in the same kind of level, actually, is it that metaphors are underpinning the models and methods that we use? So for the first part of this, I'm going to talk about 6 things about a metaphor and then a paradox. And the key thing in this talk really is, I just want to share with you some insights and thoughts and questions. I'm not going to give you answers, because answers are kind of boring. The questions are the interesting things, right? And there's a couple of paradoxes that I think are pertinent to everyone in this room. So let's begin. Number 1, ubiquity, ubiquitous. So Aristotle said that metaphors are scarce, they're rare, they're only of interest to poets, they're kind of not much use to anyone else, they're just about similarity, they are a mark of genius, because you can see the similarity between disparate things. But yeah, that's as far as they go, right? Well, I have to tell you, Aristotle was wrong. Else, why would a river have a bed? Why would a bed have a foot? Why would a building have wings? Why would bottles have necks? Which is okay, right? Bottles having necks is okay, but bottlenecks are a problem. We're always trying to remove them. Why would our organizations and businesses have heads, and our governments have bodies that have arms that have heads, which is kind of weird when you think about it. And of course, in technology, in digital technology, we talk about metaphors all the time. We use metaphors to understand technology. Our code comes in trees or tree structures. It has branches, it has trunks. Networks come with backbones. And when we deliver things in streams, and they all have nests in them, and our data comes in lakes or warehouses or mesh, and we stick it all in the bucket, and we put it in the cloud. And all of our businesses are now desperate to become platforms and remove those silos so that they can create frictionless customer experiences. And of course, the very outer edges of our technologies, the surfaces through which we gain access, are all facilitated by metaphor. And I would argue that the very ubiquitous nature of technologies in the digital world has been facilitated primarily because we use metaphors to open the door and let us in. So it's interesting to note that Alan Cooper, who is a leading light in the world of interface design, said this thing. He said, biggest problem is that by representing our technology, metaphors firmly nail our conceptual feet to the ground, forever limiting the power of our software. A metaphor to decry the use of metaphor. I'm sure he saw the irony in that. He also went on to say there aren't enough metaphors to go around. Really? Now, he may have a point there too. They don't scale. And, interestingly, the ability of users to recognize them is questionable. And all of these points are really worth exploring, and I'm going to sort of come back to some of these ideas through this talk. But I think, that what's interesting as well is that he said this almost 30 years ago. It doesn't look to me like metaphor's going away anytime soon. We're using it more and more in the way we think about technologies all the time. But that first point is really important, that he's sort of asking the question, how on earth can you realize the value or the potential of new technologies if you're always understanding them from something you already knew in the past? You limit the possibilities. But back to Aristotle and the scarcity of metaphors. Recent research shows that in the English language, English speakers are potentially using a metaphor around once every 25 words. Some research says even quicker than that, once every 20 words. Now, if you do the maths on the basic average word count for an English speaker, that means that they're uttering things in a metaphorical sense every 7 to 8 seconds. Or to put it another way, we are understanding things through metaphor every 7 to 8 seconds, i.e. understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. We're understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. Metaphors can be divisive. So, sorry, my thing's a bit weird here. You've probably come across this, if you've ever been in the UK, you've come across Marmite. Marmite, delicious, salty spread, been around for about 100 years. Not the one in my kitchen hasn't, but it might as well have been. And the Brits love to put it on their toast, love to put it on their toast for breakfast and eat it. Yum, yum. Except not everyone loves it. Some people can't stand Marmite. And so Marmite has become a metaphor for things that are divisive, things that polarize opinion. Trump is Marmite. Anchovies are Marmite. Horror movies are Marmite. I could go on. Metaphor is Marmite. There are those who would say we should eradicate Marmite from our language, especially when we're in the serious business of thinking about systems and technologies and organizational structures and things like that. Get rid of metaphor. It's woolly, it's ambiguous, you can't measure a metaphor. It's hopeless in scientific research because you can't disprove a metaphor. But there are others who would say, no, metaphors are liberating. They generate new knowledge. They allow us to seek different perspectives on things. And indeed, you can use metaphor as a way of experimenting. Now, if you've ever spent any time contemplating metaphor, you arrive at the point of view that's rather well captured here by Gareth Morgan, who wrote extensively about metaphors in organizational understanding, that metaphors both help us see and help us not see. So it's not really Marmite, it's both. Mary Catherine Bateson, anthropologist, she put it this way. She said, any metaphor is double-sided, offering both new insight and new confusion. But metaphors are not avoidable. So what do you make of that, Aristotle? Let's talk about structure or anatomy or architecture of a metaphor. Basically, metaphors come in two parts, right? There's the topic, the thing you're trying to explain, you're trying to describe to people in a group or whatever, or even to yourself. And then there's the source. The source is the thing by which you gain the understanding for the topic. So the source has to be something that you already understand, okay? And you hope that the people to whom you're describing the topic also understand the source. Lakoff and Johnson, who are the sort of titans of metaphor theory and conceptual metaphor theory in particular, they kind of say this thing which is like a really intriguing catch-22. They say that if our concepts are all based on metaphor, therefore we understand one thing by means of another, is there anything that we don't understand metaphorically? And if there isn't, how the heck can we understand anything? Which kind of blew my mind the first time I read that sentence. But it's not just a one-to-one relationship. The topic and the source have multiple facets. And what happens when we talk in a metaphorical sense is cognitively we're creating these connections all the time. What metaphor theorists would call the correspondences. And the more correspondences there are, the stronger the metaphor, the more potent, the more exciting or engaging it is. And the less there are, the less engaging. And that's when you have a conversation. You say, it's like this thing, and they go, oh, no, it's not. I don't really get what you're talking about. Because they're not being able to make the connections richly enough to understand the metaphor. Henry Moore, he talked about relationships a lot, sculptor. He said this thing, he said, place any two objects together and you're talking about a relationship. A metaphor is a relationship. So if Aristotle thought that metaphors are purely about similarity, then they must also be about difference. Difference is one of the fundamental ways in which human beings understand things or get to learn things. We create new knowledge because we understand the difference between things. Gregory Bateson said, increments of knowing follow from combining information from two or more sources. The tension that exists between the topic and the source is what creates the knowledge. It doesn't exist until you put those two things together. You create that relationship. So in a sense, I think metaphors are like systems thinking. There is an emergent property, right? The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Size. Metaphors come in lots of different sizes. There are those that are just the sort of throwaway phrases that we say all the time, like, all the world is a stage and we are but actors upon it. Except you're not at the moment, I am. And then there are metaphors that are single words. Just a word that is used in a particular context becomes a metaphor. There's a really interesting piece of research that was done a few years ago where two groups were given an identical paragraph from a crime report of a crime wave spreading across the city of Austin. The first group were given the paragraph where the crime wave was described as a virus. The second were given an identical copy of the paragraph, except virus was changed for beast. And then the participants were asked to respond with, well, how might you solve this problem? And the virus group came back with thoughts like, we're going to diagnose it, we're going to treat it, we're going to inoculate it, we're going to find the source of the problem. They talked about things like social reform. But the beast folk, they talked about capture, enforcement, punishment, incarceration, imprisonment. Interestingly as well, the researchers asked, did you spot the metaphor? And only 3% of the entire group that took part in the exercise spotted the fact that there was a metaphor at play in the paragraph. So when we think about solutions, if we actually think about the problems before we even get to the solutions, if we actually discipline ourselves to do that, we're still probably thinking about the problem metaphorically, and therefore the way we think about the problem metaphorically is going to influence the way we think about the solution. So there's also these things called conceptual metaphors. They're like the massive domains that Lakoff and Johnson, who said the thing about understanding one thing in terms of another, they developed the conceptual metaphor theory in the early 80s, and it continues to grow, and I'm by no means going to do it justice in a few minutes here, but let me try to explain what conceptual metaphor is. Conceptual metaphor is basically conceptual domains that sit in our subconsciousness that influence the way we think about specific things, things that are the big things that make us human, the things that inform the human condition, right? So things like love and anger, an argument, and money, and time, and space. So let me try to demonstrate. Hi. Hello. What's your name? Andre. Nice to meet you. Andre, I'm afraid I've got to tell you something. I think, we've known each other for years, right? But I think we've come to the end of the road. There's a turning point here. We've got a crossroads in front of us, and we've got to go our separate ways. The relationship has been so bumpy. It's like a dead-end street. Not really. Nice to meet you. When we talk about love, we use all sorts of terminology that's informed by a conceptual metaphor. Love is a journey. This is the sort of basic thinking behind conceptual metaphor theory. There's a concept, you don't say love is a journey, but you talk as though love is a journey. There's another example. There's many examples that come from conceptual metaphor theory. For example, anger. Anger is heat. It's a hot liquid, right? Hey, guys, that Andre, you want to watch him. He's such a hothead. Things are heating up over here. You want to avoid that, right? Just steer clear. Oh, my God, you make my blood boil. All right, cool down, chill. We use temperature to describe anger. Argument is war. So Lakoff and Johnson say. The conceptual metaphor going on is that there's something to win or something to lose. You shot down my argument. Your counter-argument was right on target. You completely destroyed my argument, and so on and so forth. We use all this terminology, which is really about combat. And so we think about argument not in the logical, sort of objective sense of a mathematical equation, but we think of argument as something to win or lose. Now, the interesting thing, and this is an intriguing point for me, is Lakoff and Johnson asked the question, well, if we change the concept, how would that change the way we think about argument? Imagine a culture where an argument is viewed as a dance, and in such a culture, people would view arguments differently, experience them differently, and talk about them differently. Which kind of begs a question, right? Would argument then become something that's more about cooperation instead of trying to win or lose something? And I was thinking about this question, and in the world that we work in, right, when we're trying to think about things like systems and things like organisational structures, we tend to think structurally. And there's an underlying metaphor, though you might not think it's a metaphor, but of course the metaphor is architecture. How many of you in this room are architects? Right? Yeah, lots of us are architects, or we think architecturally, right? How many of you spend your day thinking about, I don't know, shifting tons of stone, digging holes in the ground to create foundations, the structures and the moments and angles of steel girders, and the stresses and strains in materials? Probably less, right? Architecture is, I would argue, potentially, at some level, a conceptual metaphor of how we think about systems in organizations. And so you can ask the same question again. Well, what if we talk about organizations as dance instead of architecture? Would we change the language? Would we think about synchronization, coordination, balance, exchange, movement, trust in our dance partners? The interactions in time and the call and response. And you probably do. You probably do think about those things, because one of the points about conceptual metaphor theory is there's no one-to-one relationship between one concept and another. There's multiple relationships. So there's a whole network of concepts that are at play and have these relationships in our subconscious that inform the way we talk and the way we think. We don't just speak metaphorically, we think metaphorically. Excuse me. Dry mouth. We don't just speak metaphorically. We think metaphorically. He says, try to open his bottle. Oh, sorry, that was loud. Eugene Peterson, poet, theologian. He said this, I love this paragraph. Metaphor is a really remarkable kind of formation because it both means what it says and what it doesn't say. Those two things come together and it creates an imagination which is active. You're not trying to figure things out. You're trying to enter into what's there. I think at the keynote this morning, there was a point was made, lovely talk, I really enjoyed that, thank you, Sam, about being kind of in the system. And I think we are in the metaphors that we use. So, okay, let me just switch gears for a minute and let's talk about a little bit of a case study that came from one of the projects from my research. So this one was about setting the problem about how would complex legal transactions change in 10 years' time. So mergers and acquisitions, not the kind of simple transactions. And so the team was given this genericized process map, and the brief basically said, forget about low complexity, high volume, think about high complexity, low volume. So it's not annual tax returns, we know all that shit's gonna go online, that's already happening. But when two companies want to merge, and there's a very complex legal process that's behind that, how's that gonna change in 10 years' time? Now, of course, the design team were not legal experts, so they needed to find a way to understand even the dynamic between these two things. And so they came up with a metaphor. Low complexity, high volume is like making cupcakes. So what's the opposite? What's the difference? Remember I said it's partly about the difference, it's not just the similarity. So the difference to cupcakes is wedding cakes. Wedding cakes are very bespoke, they're much more expensive, you have to go to somebody and get them specially made for a particular event. Okay, so we've got this dynamic. This helps us understand the difference between low complexity, high volume, high complexity, low volume. And so what the team did was take this, this model, this process diagram, and as all good service designers will do, they will iterate on that and they will refine it and they'll break it down and they'll interview people that act in that system until it becomes more of a journey than a process. So now they're working in the comfort of their own metaphors, and they've created personas to understand the pain points and the opportunities for change. And all the time they're holding on to this source. It's not cupcakes, it's wedding cakes. And they continue to do this until they get to the point where they can now create a narrative that works in both worlds. So they can bounce between those two worlds to help them understand what the complexity of legal transactions is. So although you might think talking about cupcakes and wedding cakes is a little bit, I don't know, flippant, it's kind of trivializing the very serious business of mergers and acquisitions. What it was doing was, back to an earlier point, it was liberating them. It was liberating them from the constraints of thinking, well, I don't understand this problem. Yes, you do. You just understand it in a different world. And so the journey works like this. We have, let me do it the right way around, over here. Right, here's the business, and the business folk are coming together and they're going, hey, you know what, we need to come together because the market is changing and together we're much, much stronger, right? And they're going, yeah, we need to merge. And over here, there's the young man and he's going, will you marry me? And the bride-to-be says, yes, of course I'll marry you. So the emergent meaning between those two scenarios is a statement of intent, a promise of commitment. A promise of commitment. And at the next stage, now the business are going, okay, so we need some legal representation. Who are we going to get? We need somebody that understands our needs, the dynamics of our business, not just anybody. And over here, the couple are going, we need a wedding cake. Who's going to make us a wedding cake? So both parties go out, they go to market, they look for the right services, and the emergent meaning is seeking the services that are right for us, people who will understand us. And at the next stage, they've now hired the service, and over here, sorry, it's the wrong way around there, over here, the business is starting to say, well, you know, we probably need to kind of amalgamate these particular services. There's going to be some job cuts, there's going to be this, there's going to be that, and they're figuring out how the two organizations come together. Meanwhile, and so the service is capturing those needs. And meanwhile, over here, the couple are going, well, I need it to be a chocolate icing. Chocolate icing, okay. And I want butterflies on it. Okay, so they're gathering the requirements. They're capturing the essential elements of the artifact. And then we get to the next stage, and now it's all about negotiation. What, you don't want to get rid of your HR department? Well, then we'll have to get rid of ours. Or they come together. Well, how many job losses? Well, what's the process going to look like? And so there's all this negotiating around how are these two businesses going to come together. And over here, the couple are getting feedback from the wedding cake maker is saying, well, look, if you want 3 tiers, it's going to cost you more. Okay, well, we'll have 2 tiers instead. So there's a negotiation and a refinement of the needs until the happy day comes, the two businesses come together, they sign on the dotted line of the contract that's now been beautifully formed, they go, yay, and they renounce it to the markets, and all the shareholders are happy. Meanwhile, the happy couple have their wedding day, and all their friends and family come along and they go, yay, and they chuck confetti at them, and the cake gets cut. And so we have 2 worlds that we can understand the problem through. So basically what happens is that topic and that source in that design process is being iterated and held on to whilst they're understanding the problem, and they're starting to find the connections between the facets of both topic and source, from which they can then find patterns to generate 2 narratives in parallel to understand the problem space. Metaphors die, or do they? So there was a guy called Michel Briel, Frenchman, a philologist, someone who studies the history of language. In the 1880s, he wrote a book called Les Sémantiques. In that book was a chapter called Metaphor. In that chapter, he made the distinction that some metaphors are novel and others, well, I'm going the wrong way again, aren't I? No, novel or frozen. And novel metaphors are metaphors that are emergent in the language. They don't have a far reach. So they're high in the consciousness of those that use the metaphor, but the reach is low. And what happens over time is that metaphors seep into the language. I've never used that word before for that. Seep, that's quite a nice metaphor. They seep into the language, so the reach becomes greater, but there's an inverse that happens here because the consciousness of the metaphor becomes lower, so we don't realize that they've been used. Hence, they've become frozen in Briel's terms. Through the 20th century, the word frozen got dropped and a new metaphor was used by many who study metaphor. They call them dead. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that something that we still use in our language is dead. It's very much alive. It's just that we don't really recognize it as being there. We don't go to the graveyard of metaphors and lay the flowers on the old metaphor because we don't use it. No, we're still using it. We just don't realize it. I think a better term might be invisible. Metaphors become invisible or even camouflaged. They're hidden in plain sight. We're not seeing them, we're not hearing them, but we're using them all the time. Which of course begs the question, what do these metaphors that are hidden in plain sight, what misconceptions do they lead to? What misnomers do they create? Well, it can be a short-term thing, or it can be a much longer-term thing that changes the way our thinking goes, right? If a habit can be formed in 28 days, or whatever the theory is, I forget. Is it 28 days, or is it 52 days, or something like that, to form a habit? Then if there are fundamental metaphors in our language that have been around for hundreds of years, boy, is that going to take some kicking to get rid of that habit. So there's a paradox here for me, which is that metaphors are both hugely creative. They're the source of lots of creative thinking, and yet, because they sort of fade into the background but continue to be there, there's a flaw in that kind of concept. And the more that we're designing for solutions that defy the laws of the physical world, the more this becomes an issue for all of us when we're thinking about how we design solutions. For example, the Cartesian doctrine that said we can understand the universe as a machine, as clockwork, that we can break it down and just understand it by the analysis of the constituent parts. We don't have to think about the whole. Or the idea that cause and effect can be used as a way of intervening into a system that's highly complex, which every time you intervene into it, even with the same intervention, is going to respond differently, right? I mean, Zin talked about this, didn't you? When I was watching your talk, I was thinking, she's stolen my thunder again. But no, seriously, we're all on the same page here, I think. Because actually, on this point, you talked about leverage points, right? And I think there's a subtle difference between what a leverage point is and what a lever is, which I'll come to. And when we first invented steam engines, we had a problem we'd never had before, because we'd always relied on wind or water or muscle. Suddenly we had a system that if you didn't have a method for controlling the system, it would just blow up. So the first time we had a system that needed governance. We invented this mechanism, the governor, as the way to regulate a system. But when we think about all of these things, these mechanistic things, do they help us in a complex world? And yet, you hear it all the time. Management talk about levers to pull, dials to turn, buttons to press, as though there's a direct correlation between a particular cause and effect, and it's all predictable, and there's going to be a lovely outcome. So, here's the thing. We need to turn our attention to design for a minute, right? And I feel that's okay, right? Because we're all designers here. We must be. We're at a conference that's got design in the name, right? So, I'm going to talk about future, everyone, complex, conversation, and intention. Design is inherently a human act that takes us into the future. Again, I think I heard it said this morning that we can't analyze the future, or something along those lines, right? We can analyze the present because it's there, but you can't analyze the future because it's not there. We can analyze the present and the past, and we can make suppositions, we can think about possible futures. So we can speculate about the future. We can have plausible futures, we can have possible futures, we can have probable futures, degrees of possibility. We can't predict the future, but we can design a way to the future. Or put it better, we can design a way to a future. Now, there are many models that describe this process, and they all look beautifully symmetrical or very clean. And of course, the design process is a very messy business of taking 2 steps forward and 1 back, and then 4 steps forward and 2 back. But we generally move through this process of exploring a problem, asking a question, reframing the question. So the double diamond, the one in the middle, I'm sure lots of you are familiar with that one. Divergent thinking, convergent thinking, focus on a problem, then divergent and convergent. Again, this is design thinking. The idea is that you go from the present state to a future state through that design thinking. The one on the right is from IDEO, Tim Brown, beautifully iterative inspiration, ideation, implementation. 3 circles for a design process. The one on the left by Doubly, it was on the left, isn't it? Yeah. Doubly, Everson, and Robinson. Has anyone come across this? The analysis synthesis bridge model. Who knows this one? No one? Oh God, there's people up there as well. Wow. Hi. This one I really like. I've used this a lot in my own research. It works like this. There's a concrete world, and there's an abstract world. And there's a present, and there's a future. And so when we're tackling problems, we are in the concrete present. That's where we are. And we make models of what the present is. We abstract it. We draw diagrams, we create models, we create frameworks. This is all an abstraction of the present. And then what we do is we iterate on that. So our models change, and those models become models of a future state. And through doing that, we're starting to move into a future state, because then we can realize a future through those models that become the way we describe a future state. This is why this is called the analysis synthesis bridge model. I like the fact it's a bridge model when I'm talking to an audience full of architects. Feel on safe ground there. And the point here is, and just to say, I've added these words because I think basically there's three legs here, right, to the bridge. One is about sense making, one is about prototyping, and one is about solutioning. And as I said before, design is not as clean as this. It's a messy business, but we sort of move from making sense of something to making something through to solutioning something. This is what the design process is. And metaphor plays a role in this. Metaphor can help us move through these different processes. We can use metaphors to make sense of the unfamiliar. We can use metaphors within the prototypes we make, and probably do. And of course, we also use metaphors sometimes in the solutions that we create. They actually embody the metaphor that was part of the solution. And so this can go on all the time in different ways through this process, and we can even start with a question that's metaphorical to frame the design problem. One of the projects we ran as part of my research was with a group of colleagues from ThoughtWorks, where we explored what's the future of consulting services and how might you change it as a self-organizing system. But imagine it's a forest. So we talked entirely about a forest. And so we were kind of jumping between the source being a forest, because everyone understands the forest, and consulting services as the topic. But actually, it wasn't that simple, because everybody had a different idea of what a forest was. Someone from New Zealand thinks a forest is a different thing to what someone from Northern Europe thinks of as a forest. So it still had its issues. Right, okay, what's happened there? Let's go back. Right, so just to illustrate, that project that I talked about earlier, you can recognize the wedding cake analogy, the metaphor helped the sense making, but that team actually, they continue to use the metaphor through the early sort of prototyping that they were creating. All of these little wireframes actually talked about buying cakes, not about a legal process. But gradually the legal process crept in to the prototypes as they became more sort of high fidelity prototypes. But even this one, which was a prototype for describing how a lawyer might consider their skill development, still had, I don't know if you can see it in that picture, but it's got little icons that are about bread making. It's got nothing to do with legal process, but it didn't matter because they could work in that source of making things, cooking things, as a way to just explore the possibility of having some sort of skill development model. Next point to say about design is we all design. We all design, right? Everyone designs. And ever since somebody picked up a stone and sharpened it and turned it into a spearhead, we were engaged in the process of design. We just didn't call it design. Actually, the sort of self-conscious act of designing is a relatively new thing. As a profession, as a self-conscious process, rather than something that's about tacit knowledge, that's about explicit knowledge, design is a relatively new thing, with theorists and people like me that spend all our time just kind of reading loads of documents about design and thinking about design. So it's no surprise it was as recently, relatively, in the course of human history, it's recently as 1968 that Herbert Simon, economist, said this thing: everyone designs, who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. Everyone designs. And I'm going to come back to that and just revisit that sentence a little later. Does anybody think they don't design? No hands going up. We all design, right? Number 3. Design problems are increasingly complex leading to greater abstraction. So when you think about that doubly analysis synthesis bridge model, we pretty quickly move into that top left-hand corner, and we're dealing with abstractions of abstract things all the time, very abstract things. We're not dealing with concrete, we're dealing with systems that are not concrete. Put it this way, today more and more design problems are reaching insoluble levels of complexity. Actually, that was said by Christopher Alexander, who was a design theorist from 1964. So almost 60 years ago, he said that. So that kind of leads to a question in itself, right? Are things becoming more complex, or are we just becoming more cognizant of complexity? And maybe it's a bit of both, right? Maybe it's a bit of both, because of course we're creating more hyperconnected technologies which create more complexity. But if you think back to inventing the steam engine, well, they were already engaging in complexity, they just didn't think about it. If they'd thought about it 200 years ago, I'm not blaming them, right? But if the inventors of steam engines had thought about the complexity they were now grappling with, the Pandora's box that they were opening, we might not have some of the problems we have today with global warming. So there's always been a complexity at some level or other. It's just how do we recognize the complexity that we're working with? Christopher Alexander said this thing, and then he goes on to say, which kind of dates it somewhat, quite nicely, this is true not only of moon bases, factories, and radio receivers. You've got to think, this was written sort of 5 years before somebody stepped on the moon. So moon bases were probably still kind of like an amazing future thing. Whose complexity is internal, but even of villages and tea kettles. I love the villages and tea kettles bit. I mean, you know, tea kettles are relatively simple things, but I guess maybe what he was talking about was the fact that even a tea kettle has a complexity in that you need to mine materials, you need to create plastics, and then you make this thing, and then what are you going to do with it when it dies and it's no longer functional? So there's a complexity in its life cycle. Maybe that's what he meant by that. But maybe he was also, in some respects, foretelling the Internet of Things, where a tea kettle might talk to a fridge, say, or an app on a phone. Alexander presented this model in his book from 1964, which was Notes on a Synthesis of Form, in case you're wondering. And this model describes the design considerations for what he calls a simple design problem, like making a vacuum cleaner. So you've got performance, you've got economy, you've got jointing, and you've got simplicity. So you've got 6 relationships, and again, going back to this morning's talk, most of those relationships he puts a minus against, and there's a tension in that relationship. There's only one relationship there where there's a positive relationship between jointing and simplicity. So I wonder how this model might change if we were to develop this to represent the kind of design considerations that we all have to tackle in our daily lives. So I might start by going, well, jointing feels a bit redundant when it's an abstract world, so let's change jointing for boundary. Because boundary is like the sort of jointing between different aspects of a system. But even that we think about metaphorically, because we talk about boundaries being porous, or boundaries being like cells that allow things through them. Or in some cases, boundaries must be impervious, because if we're talking, for example, about data securities or something like that, then there's a sense in which there needs to be a boundary that is impervious. But essentially, we're talking about boundaries, and if we're talking about boundaries, then simplicity, which of course is always an admirable thing to go for in any design solution, find the simple design solution or the elegant design solution, but I'm going to change simplicity to autonomy. Where do you draw the boundaries in order to allow the autonomy to take place? Because so much of the time now what we talk about when we talk about systems is living systems, which, well, I'd be interested to hear what people say, so please come and tell me afterwards. We talk about living systems. That's a metaphor in itself, isn't it? Or is it reality? I'm not sure. I'm not sure when metaphors become the actual thing, but we certainly talk about systems as though they're living. They display the behaviors of living systems. So clearly, these 4 nodes are not enough. I need to add another one. Anybody got any thoughts? What might be the next node that we add to this model? Any suggestions? Deathly silence. Okay, just as well I've got an answer. How about environment? If it's a living system, then it has a relationship with an environment, right? So that's got to be a design consideration, is what's the environment? And already now, I'm starting to think, God, I can't quite figure out what's a positive or a negative relationship. I'm sure I could if I spent the time, but it gets a bit more ambiguous as to what's supporting what. Okay, so I'm going to add another one. Anybody got any guesses? Oh. Perhaps, yes. Perhaps there is an environment, of course, because, you know, and I'll come to this point a bit later. So the question was, is there implicitly there's an environment because we're talking about boundaries. There's the things that are within and the things that are without. It depends, I guess, on what the scale of the entity is that we're talking about. We could be talking about a team within an organization. We could be talking about an organization within an ecosystem, or we could be talking about an ecosystem within the world, and therefore what's the biosphere. So the boundary and therefore what the environment is, and therefore what the relationship between the entity and the environment changes depending on what boundary you're drawing. And of course, if we're talking about any kind of system, then surely purpose has to be a consideration. What the hell are we doing this thing for? In fact, I would argue that it should have probably been in the original model, because if I design a vacuum cleaner, I'm not quite sure what the purpose is, and I'm not sure why I'm designing a vacuum cleaner. Okay, so I'm going to add another node. We've got to 6 nodes now, 15 relationships. So there are 30 different perspectives that you can take on this design problem. So I think leadership is probably another design consideration. What does leadership do in this system? How does it change if I'm changing the existing system? What aspects of leadership remain top-down? What do we federate throughout the system? This is the major design consideration, right? And therefore, surely decisioning, how we make decisions, how we place a boundary around decision rights is a fundamental part of our design question. So I'm now up to 8 nodes and 28 relationships and 56 directions on this design problem. So I'm going to add another one. If it's in an environment, it needs to sense the environment, or it needs to sense itself. How does the system understand when it's performing well? What's the data it's receiving, both from within itself or from without itself? Sensing feels to me like that's probably pretty important. So now I'm up to 9 nodes and 36 relationships. Well, outcomes must surely be another one, right? So outcomes. What is the point in designing this if we don't know the purpose and the outcome? So I'm up to 10 nodes and 45 relationships and 90 directions. A design problem of this complexity clearly cannot be designed purely by design professionals or a designer or a group of designers. This has to be a conversation, right? A conversation that takes place between multidisciplinary groups, professional or otherwise, the actors in the system. This is what we're dealing with as we go into these levels of complexity and abstraction. And of course, I could have added many more terms there: sustainability, regulation, diversity, self-organization, and many others. I'm not saying this is the right model, just a way of thinking about it. So design becomes a conversation. Back in the day, philosopher Donald Shun observed the design process, and he developed this whole kind of concept of reflection in action. Donald Shun actually worked very closely with Aguirre, who you mentioned on your slides too. And Donald Shun sort of talked about the conversation between the designer and the materials. There's a conversation that the designer has. So an architect in the sort of traditional sense of architecture would be having a conversation with the materials to figure out the problem that he's trying to solve. I would suggest that in a world of complexity and abstraction, the conversation becomes the central material of the design problem. The conversation is, if you like, the fabric. And the fabric is woven by all the perceptions and misconceptions and metaphors that are going on between the people who are effectively weaving that fabric as part of discussing the design problem. And so if, as designers, we don't pay attention to that conversation, we don't have a conversation with the conversation itself, how do we understand the intentions that are going on here? Because intention is ultimately the important point here about design that we're all doing, right? Is what is the intention of the design? So I want to go back to Herbert Simon's statement. Everyone designs who devises courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So there's at least 5 words in that sentence that are implicitly about intention. Devising, action, aimed, changing, preferred. I wonder whether, you see, the thing about this sentence, I don't know if you've seen this sentence before, but if you do any design research, you will find this sentence cropping up all the time, because anybody that writes a paper about design goes, what is design? Well, Herbert Simon said this thing. And so this is repeated often throughout design literature. But I would suggest that maybe we have to rethink this now. It's time to revisit this sentence, take these words and shuffle them around and have a slightly different sentence, maybe add a couple of words. So maybe what we come up with instead is that everyone who articulates courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones designs outcomes, intentionally or otherwise. Intentionally or otherwise. And here's the paradox. So metaphor is constantly informing our concepts of understanding, and yet half the time we don't even know they're there. They have faded away, they've become hidden in plain sight. That's what's going on the one hand. Sorry, I should have said on the one hand. On the other hand, design is an expression for the future that is about intention for the future. And yet, we rely on metaphor to understand the complex problems for which we're trying to design. So where does intention begin and end? How can we be conscious of that? This to me is like the central design paradox that we all face if we're trying to design in that complex world. So how might we respond? I'm going to go back to Mary Catherine Bateson, who said this. She said, we use metaphors consciously or unconsciously all the time, so it is a matter of mental hygiene, to take responsibility for these metaphors, to look at them carefully, to see how meanings slide from one to the other. I really like that. That to me is a call to action that we should all pay attention to. So a final thought. It's not what we think, therefore we are. It's not what we think, therefore we are. You're all familiar with the phrase from Cartesian doctrine, I think, therefore I am. When we thought that we could understand the universe as though it's a machine, what dominated Western philosophy was that we were separate to it. We could stand outside of it. We could look at it from afar. We could observe the system. But of course, we are inherently in the system. Lakoff and Johnson, part of the basis, only part, but it's a significant part of the basis of the conceptual metaphor theory, says this, that our experiences are as fundamental as the bodies we live in the environment in which we live. Our sense of what is inside or what is outside, the boundary that you asked about earlier, right? The boundary of our bodies is the first boundary we understand, boundaries of cells and so on. So understanding what inside and outside is comes from being inside a body. Understanding what up and down is comes from the fact that we stand up, we lie down, or what's in front or what's behind when I'm looking forward to seeing you. And when I look back on this conference and I think, oh, that was fantastic. Looking forward and looking back, it's all about the fact we're bodies in an environment. So it's not perhaps so much I think, therefore I am. Maybe it's more that I am, and therefore I think. Because of being, the being of being in a body is what fundamentally underpins so much of our thought. And if we were to remove or try and extrapolate ourselves from that metaphorical understanding, what do we become? Does our intelligence become artificial? So I had a chat with ChatGPT, as I do, and I said, give me a metaphor. Oh, I should have shared this with you. I haven't got it here. I said, give me a metaphor for speaking at a conference. And it came up with this enormously elaborate thing. And I said, no, make it more simple. And I end up having this conversation, toing and froing, and go, no, that's not a good metaphor. That's too corny. Give me another one. Oh, well, I'm really sorry that wasn't meeting your requirements. And so it kept giving me different metaphors and so on. And I'm just fascinated as we stand on the brink of unleashing thought into our systems in some way, shape, or other. How does that work? How does that work? Are the ghosts of our past metaphors inherently present in the machines of the future? And I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for coming.